Today, we're going to learn English with a story about a remarkable woman in American history so that you can learn vocabulary and phrases in the best way possible in context with a real story. Welcome to English Coach 3Ts. If we haven't met, my name is Tanya. I am the creator of our She Speaks Fluency program for women, and I live here in beautiful Southern California, but probably not what you're thinking of beaches and all of that wonderful stuff that we have here. I actually live in the mountains in Southern California. So, who is our remarkable woman today? Today, I'm going to be telling you about Sojourner Truth. Have you ever heard of Sojourner Truth? I put her name in the chat so that you could see it if you're here live. And the reason I ask this is Sojourner Truth is a name that I had heard growing up here in the United States, but it isn't someone that I knew a lot about. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this series about remarkable women in the United States, because there are so many women and people in general who did so much that contributed to history that I know so little about. And learning these things is not only interesting, it's a great way to improve your English fluency. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I have 10 things to tell you about Sojourner Truth, and then I want to help you to use what you've heard here today so that you can continue becoming more fluent. So Sojourner Truth was born with the name Isabella Baumfree. I have some notes here, so I'm sure to get the facts straight. She was born in 1797 in New York, and unfortunately, she was born into slavery at that time. So New York was a state that had slavery at that time. Pardon me. And in 1799, just a couple years after she was born, slavery was abolished in New York, but the emancipation of the slaves was gradual. In other words, freeing the slaves took time. And they were indentured servants until they reached their 20s. So an indentured servant is someone who has to work for someone for a certain amount of time for very little or no pay to pay back a debt. Typically, it's for no pay, and it isn't much better than slavery. The one of the benefits is at a certain time, in this case, many years, you will be freed. Sadly, she was sold several times. So I just want to think about that for a minute, because when we talk about slavery, we say these things like this slave was sold and da 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 da, like it is just, I sold this blanket and then I did it. No, this human being was sold away from her family like an item, like a thing. And not only that, taken away from her family and from her home. Today, I can say that even if we have to move, whether we want to or not, it's stressful, but especially if we didn't have a choice, moving is extremely stressful. So this was the start to a very stressful life for Sojourner Truth. Another really interesting thing about her is that her first language was Dutch. Even though she was born here in the United States, it was in the late 1700s, and she was owned by a Dutch family. And so she didn't learn English until she was sold to an English-speaking family. I think this is incredible and makes it so that those of us who are learning a language like you and I can really understand. We can understand um, this difficulty of living in a country and not speaking the language that most other people speak. I need to correct myself. I often say, even native speakers make mistakes. Of course, this is true. Even English teachers make mistakes. I said language learners like you and that particular case should have been language learners like you and me. And one of my little tricks for remembering this is that if I just said language learners like me, I probably wouldn't make that mistake. Because I know that I would not say language learners like I. So this will help you to remember you and I, you and me, those kinds of things. Welcome. I see some familiar names here. It's great to see you. I see people from Mexico and Brazil. And where else are we? Are people from Africa? Welcome. Have you ever heard of Sojourner Truth? And if you have, what do you know about her? Okay, number two, in 1826, she escaped from slavery with her infant daughter, and she found refuge with a Quaker family. So, to find refuge is she found a family who helped her, hid her, fed her, gave her somewhere to live, and this family actually bought her freedom. Again, just this statement to someone would buy your freedom, I think is almost something we can't even really imagine. We can kind of think about it. Of course, we can imagine that thing, but we can't imagine what that would be like. We can have some idea, but unless you've been owned by someone, I think it's impossible to really know how that would be. I think we can all agree it would be horrible. In 1828, so 2 years later, she took legal action so that she could get her son, who was sold as a slave to another owner. This is one of the things that breaks my heart so much, pardon me, that as a slave you would have a child and then they would sell that child to another owner is unbelievable to me. And what's even more atrocious, there's a word for you, more horrible, more terrible, more atrocious, is that oftentimes this child was the child of your owner. There was a white man who would be the father of this child, and often it was just really, really horrible. Nonetheless, even if you were forced into having sex with someone, it doesn't matter. You still love this child who is your baby. And Sojourner took legal action to get her son back. Now, this is incredible for many, many reasons, but one of the most incredible reasons is she never learned to read or write, but she did stand up for herself legally, something I think a lot of people would find very difficult, even if they did know the language and could read and write. But remember, this is her second language and she can't read and write. Number three was that I have to share with you today is her name change. She changed her name from her birth name, Isabella Baumfree, to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner, to sojourn, means to travel around from place to place. So she was someone who traveled around from place to place, sharing truth. Religion was something that was very important to her. And of course, that was a part of her message, but her message also had a lot of universal truths, things that I think are very important and were very important to the development of our country, the United States. Um, Number four, I shared a little bit about, she was deeply religious. So we can say somebody is deeply religious. We mean very religious. And you may have heard on Instagram and YouTube and other platforms online, don't use the word very. Don't say very religious. Don't say very tired. Don't say very hungry. I'm here to tell you that as a native speaker, we use the word very all the time. So, of course, you can use this word. It is so natural. It is just completely natural. However, it's very natural. However, there are lots of words you can learn and use that will help you to sound natural in other ways. And deeply religious is a very common way for us to say that someone is very religious. Um, she, as I said, traveled around speaking. She was a great orator, in other words, a great speaker. And some of the crowds she spoke to reacted with violence. And one group of white men threatened to burn down the tent that she was speaking at. So I think, to me, one of the incredible things about this woman is one of the things I've shared with you so far, we're only on number 4, would have been an incredibly difficult thing. However, she had several things that she had to overcome. I'm curious, have you ever heard of Sojourner Truth? But also, if you have any other questions, you can write them in the comments. I will do my best to answer them live or in the comments. Okay, I see there's one question about me. Are you better from your accident? Yes, I'm much better from my accident. I cut myself very badly. I talked about it in another live. You can go back and listen to those. Um, I think it was actually a week ago today that I talked about it. And thank you for asking. Very kind of you. All right. I'm going to look here what happened to my numbers. My numbers went away. So hopefully I'm going to say this correctly. Number 5 is she became a prominent abolitionist, someone who worked to abolish slavery or to get rid of slavery. The phrasal verb to get rid of something is much more common, especially today. If we don't want to have anything anymore, we get rid of that, whatever it is. Is this phrasal verb to get rid of a phrasal verb that you own? I've been saying this a lot lately here on YouTube and my Instagram. If you don't follow me on Instagram, I have the same name there. You can go follow me for some different content there. In fact, I just posted a great vocabulary word there. But to get rid of, if you own this phrasal verb, it means not only do you know it, not only do you understand it, but you can use this phrasal verb. It not only can you use it, you do use it in your everyday conversation. I'm curious, let me know in the chat, do you own the phrasal verb to get rid of something? You can say, yes, I own it, or you could, even better, put an example using this phrasal verb to get rid of something. So, Sojourner Truth was one of many people who worked very hard to get rid of slavery, to abolish slavery and restore the rights of African Americans. And she was closely tied or worked very much. You can say that, but closely tied is I think a more natural way to say that, with Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, two well-known abolitionists, and she became an important part of that movement to get rid of slavery. Number 6, and again, I lost my numbers on my notes, so I hope they're going to be correct. She became a Oh, no, I already said that part. Number 6 is she published a book. Now, if you've been here listening since the beginning, you know that I said she never in her whole life learned to read or write. How did she publish a book? She narrated her life story or told her life story to someone who then wrote it down for her. You could say she dictated it to the person who wrote this all down, and the book was published. The name of it is The Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave. To me, this is also incredible. Again, I said earlier that this is not someone who I knew a lot about. I had heard of her, but I did not know as much about her as I do now, since I did a little research to share with you. And I think that this is an important thing, learning about some of the people in history who aren't as well known. There could be many reasons that someone is not as well known. It's not necessarily because they didn't contribute a lot. She did contribute a lot. Number 7, she's most known for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" I'm going to write this in the chat because this word "ain't," if you used it in your English class here in the United States or pretty much anywhere, would be considered incorrect. As a child, when anyone used the word "ain't," they were corrected, especially in school. So it would have been more correct, depending on how you look at correct, to say, "Am I not a woman? Am I not a woman?" Her point in this very famous speech, I'll get to in just a second, because I want to say this was a part of what was very commonly used. This type of language was very commonly used in her circle of friends, in the people she spent a lot of time with. I think this is very important because I remember when Tiana and Talia and Trinity were learning sign language, and we could sign a lot of things to each other. So was that correct? Okay. Among the deaf community, that would not be considered correct, the way we were signing to each other. But it was working very well for us. In fact, it made our lives work even better because I could sign to them when there were times that I couldn't speak to them. So I say this because we are so focused on what is correct. If you have a job or you're going to school or there is some place where you need to learn correct English, then that is important. But keep in mind that part of the way we learn is by making mistakes, and sometimes just being able to communicate what we need to say, it works. In this speech, I said I would tell you more about this. The name of the speech became, they didn't have this name in the beginning, but she spoke about the idea of being a woman. At this time, women were treated as if they were very fragile, like they would break, like they needed a lot of help. And while it can be very nice to have help and very nice to help another person, women could do a lot of things that people thought they couldn't do, or at least they acted like they couldn't do these things, like they couldn't walk over a mud puddle, they couldn't get into their transportation by themselves. And Sojourner's point in this speech was, "I've been walking over mud puddles my whole life. Ain't I a woman?" In other words, am I not a woman? Yes, she's obviously a woman. I've been getting on the transportation I need to get on by myself my whole life. Ain't I a woman? Am I not a woman? Of course, she was a woman. And her further point that she suffered much more difficult things. She did much more difficult things than those things. And she was certainly a woman. And this is one of the things that made her even more remarkable, was that as a Black woman in the United States, she didn't only stand up for the rights of African Americans, but also the rights of all women. And I think this is incredible, especially since certainly she didn't need to do that. She didn't have to do that. She was a person who had high morals and integrity. All right. One of the words I wrote down here to share with you is her resilience as a woman. Resilience. Is this word new to you? Resilience. Let me know in the comments. Do you know the word resilience? Even if you don't own this word, even if you aren't able to use it all the time, because this is an advanced word, see if you can guess what it means or try using it in a comment. Because as I said before, and I say all the time, even if you make a mistake, I would say, especially if you make a mistake, you will be learning. All right, I see Hannah has a question. What is the full of ain't I a woman? What does ain't? Let's see. Is there more to your question, Hannah? I think you may have missed that I was saying that ain't is a word that we do not encourage people to use, mostly because it's looked down on. Here's another phrasal verb for you. It's looked down on by many people. Of course, there are groups of people here in the United States that use that word regularly. It just depends on who you're spending time with. But it means isn't, can mean isn't, it can mean am I not. In this case, she meant, am I not a woman? Of course she was a woman. I love it that we have some examples of our other phrasal verb to get rid of. And I see here, Rita gives the example to get rid of bad habits. Yes, this is a very common way to use this phrasal verb. Regnum says, I've heard of Angela Davis, but not Sojourner Truth. Who is Angela Davis? I have not heard of. I mean, that's a very common name. I've, of course, heard that name. I did talk about my leg earlier, so if you missed the first part, you can go back and read the, or not read, well, I think you can read the transcript, but watch the recording. Callum, hi, it's good to see you again. Yes, I'd like to get rid of some weight. You can say to get rid of some weight, but it would be more common to say, I'd like to lose weight. I'd like to lose weight. Thank you for your comment. And again, this is a great way to learn. Okay. I was talking about, let me see on my notes here, resilience. I think there must be at least one or two of you here right now who knows the word resilience. See if you can use it in an example. Someone who is resilient is someone who keeps going and keeps doing things even though it's difficult. So we have pretty much established, I think we can pretty much agree, that Sojourner Truth had an extremely difficult life, but she kept going and working towards something that was important to her. This is resilience. She is a resilient and remarkable woman. See if you can give me an example of resilience. Who do you know that is resilient? Are you resilient when it comes to learning English? I would say this is one of the things that is very important for learning a language, is having resilience, because to continue even when things are difficult is extremely important to learning a language and becoming fluent. If you're not resilient, maybe you're becoming resilient. Maybe you're learning to be resilient. And if you're listening today, this is a great way to improve your fluency. Okay, I don't remember what number we're on. I think 7 or 8. During the Civil War, she recruited African American men to fight for the Union Army. So again, really contributing to the United States. And after the war, she worked to help free slaves and integrate them into society. So integrating them into society to help them become a part of society. And she advocated for for land grants for former slaves. So this is my next point, I think 8, I'm not sure. She met with President Abraham Lincoln, who many people have heard of because he's one of our most famous presidents, and worked with him to get land grants for former slave. A grant means it's something that is given to you. It's granted to you based on some criteria, or in other words, something that makes you meet the needs for this particular grant. Sojourner is remembered as a powerful orator. I said this earlier. And someone who stood up for, here's another phrasal verb for you, someone who stood up for, this is the past tense, to stand up for the rights of slaves and women. And she inspired many movements that are still working in this same direction today. I saw I heard a quote from another person while I was researching her, and I thought they used such a great word. I wanted to share it with you. They said she was one of the gutsiest women in American history, black or white. Gutsy. She was gutsy, one of the gutsiest women, meaning, so I'll put the base word here too. She was gutsy, meaning she was courageous, but not just courageous, she was bold and adventurous. And I would agree based on the few things that I've learned about her. She's no longer living. She was a very gutsy person. In looking up this word to make sure I could share it with you in the most appropriate way, gutsy could also mean audacious, which is another word I've used in some of the other videos for this series. So you might want to go back and look at those words. But audacious can be like to have nerve. I can't believe you would do that. This is audacious, and this could be a part of saying that she was gutsy. All right, I have a quote from Sojourner that I want to share with you. But first, I want to share that if you are a woman who would like to work with me, I'd like to invite you to my free class for women. And I'll put the link below so you can find that link and sign up for the class time that works best for you. And let's talk about this quote from Sojourner. It was difficult for me to choose a quote, but I ended up choosing, there's another phrasal verb for you. I ended up choosing, so I finally chose this quote. Truth is powerful and it prevails. To prevail means to triumph. To win, you could say, or to persist. And persist is very similar to resilient. Being resilient is someone who persists, continues. And so I thought this was a great quote that really encompasses everything that she was about. What questions do you have? Put them in the chat. I'm going to look and see what we have already in the chat before we finish up today. Here's an example from Rita. I was resilient years ago after going through a very hard time in my life. Great example, Rita. Ursula asks, is resilience the same as perseverance? It's very similar. Resilience is like perseverance. Regnum says, you previously said ain't is not a word, but it is in use. This is a great point. English teachers from forever ago, as long as I can remember, have said ain't is not a word. This is what they say. I would say, of course it is a word. People use it. It is a word that is in use, but it is frowned upon. There's another one. To be frowned upon is similar as to be looked down on. It's looked down on. It isn't encouraged. In fact, many people will say, do not use this word. I would suggest for those of you who would like to continue becoming more fluent, that you look into this word, find out more about it, look into it. This is another phrase, to look into. Yes, to look into is another phrasal verb, to look into. Lots of phrasal verbs today. Is to find out more about it, to research it, to look into something. Let's see if there are any other questions or comments. Dragika Gorgiev says, I'm very resilient to all challenges that I come across in my learning process. Excellent example. Thank you so much for the hearts and for letting me know where you're listening from and your questions. I see one more question and then I'm going to wrap it up because I have a class. Oh my goodness, this has been a long life. I have a class in just a few minutes. This last question, do you think whether this song title, I Against, is grammatically correct? I think it's incorrect. If we just say I against, it's grammatically incorrect. We would say I am against something. Thank you for joining me. If I didn't get to your question, please go watch the recording and put your question in the comments. And if you want to continue becoming even more fluent, then I will put another video here for you to watch as soon as YouTube lets me put the video here. But I also have videos down in the description if you want to watch them there. Thanks again, and I'll see you either this Wednesday or next Monday for another live coming soon.